Hey everybody, Mary Fran Bontempo here. And before we get started with today's show, I just wanted to let you know that my new book, From Broken to Brilliant, How to Live a Brilliantly Resilient Life, is available on Amazon. Super excited about this book, which provides a roadmap of how to live a brilliantly resilient life. You'll get advice not only from me, but from so many dozens of our podcast guests who were kind enough to share their tips on how to reset, rise, and reveal your own brilliance. So head on over to Amazon, get a copy of the book From Broken to Brilliant, and now let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Brilliantly Resilient podcast. What's your train wreck? Everyone has one. The question is, are you just visiting or are you going to live there? I'm Mary Fran Bontempo. Join me and let's learn how to come through those train wrecks, not broken, but brilliant. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Brilliantly Resilient Live. I am your host, Mary Fran Bontempo, and I am here with a guest today that I am really interested in taking a deep dive into his expertise. I have with me today Toby Mildon, who is a workplace inclusion consultant specializing in DEI and how to make workplace inclusion something that benefits everyone, including the company, including communities in general, as well as individuals. So, Toby, thanks so much for joining me today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me along.
It's taken us a while to connect because you are a busy man, and I'm really glad that we had this opportunity. So, Toby, the whole idea of DEI is a hot issue right now, a hot topic. And I think for good and, unfortunately, for good and bad reasons, because some things have become derailed. But I really wanted to get into this topic with you because I feel like your perspective can kind of help get us back on track and maybe even broaden the concept of DE&I a little bit further. But before we get into that, I want to hear a little bit about your backstory and how you moved into this field and how you got to be where you are professionally. So tell me about Toby Mildon.
So I was able to switch careers and move into diversity and inclusion when I was working for the BBC. So prior to that career switch, I spent many years working in IT and technology. So I was an IT consultant for Accenture. I then worked in healthcare technology, implementing software into hospitals. And then I ended up at the BBC as a project manager, working on the development of the news website and the Sounds app, which is where people listen to radio or podcasts, as well as accessibility projects. And it was whilst I was working in the technology department that I got involved in D&I. So I used to work really closely with the chief operating officer, and he was concerned, along with the rest of the senior leadership team, about the lack of women working within the technology and engineering department compared to the rest of the BBC. So the BBC at the time had a kind of roughly 50-50 gender split. Um, and but within technology, only 14% of our workforce were women. So the leadership team came up with a plan to address that gender imbalance, but they needed a project manager to implement it, and that's where I volunteered. I was getting a bit bored working on IT projects, and I was really passionate about diversity and inclusion. So thankfully, I was able to make the career switch while I was there. And then after spending a few years at the BBC, my role grew and expanded. I was able to take on other BBC departments, not just technology and engineering. And also, I quickly realized that diversity and inclusion wasn't just about gender either, that we had to take into other demographics. So I was able to kind of expand the diversity and inclusion agenda to look at other aspects. And then I left the BBC because I wanted to kind of get back into the corporate world, and I worked for Deloitte, the accountancy firm, for a couple of years. And really, they had much more focus on shifting culture, creating a culture of respect and inclusion, as they put it. And then about 5 years ago, I left the city and set up my own consultancy firm.
You know, it's funny. You hit on so many things that are of interest to me, particularly because, as tends to happen when we focus on something and give it a name,
Mm,
we generally focus on the thing that started us on that issue. And in your case with the BBC, it was the lack of women in technology. So it was DEI as a gender issue.
yeah,
And I think DE&I has become almost, or at least started out as, and this is where we need to broaden it, started out as a thing, one thing, and we quickly realized that if we're going to be true to what that means, it has to be
mm,
even a bigger thing. And
yeah,
I think that's what we're
yeah,
finding over here in the United States too. I mean, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's disability, whatever the category is, in order for DE&I to become really effective, it has to include all of those things. So
yeah.
did your processing through this and these different places that you went, is that what helped maybe expand your idea of what DE&I means?
Yeah, I mean, I've been on a journey myself because I wasn't a professional diversity and inclusion person until managed to do that career switch at the BBC. I had insights into other aspects of diversity because I was born with a rare genetic neuromuscular disability. So I've been a wheelchair user all my life. So I've got personal lived experience of disability. And even before I got involved in diversity and inclusion at the BBC as a professional, I used to run the BBC's disabled staff network. And our job was to represent the voices of disabled people working within the corporation. So I already had that kind of background experience. So even going into the D&I role in technology and engineering, I was quickly thinking about this is not just about gender balance, that we have to be quickly thinking about other aspects of diversity. And this is, I mean, it's a conversation I have with my clients a lot because one thing, like within the D&I world, there is unfortunately a hierarchical and siloed way of thinking. So a lot of organizations say, oh yeah, we're hell bent on increasing diversity and inclusion. Right now our focus is on women or gender balance at board level or within a particular department because they feel that there's a particular underrepresentation. Next year, we're going to be focusing on ethnicity and race. The year after that, we might do something around LGBT. Um, and then eventually we'll get round to disability. And there does seem to be this very kind of hierarchical, siloed way of thinking. Whereas what I'm trying to get my clients nowadays to think about more is about the inclusion. Because if you imagine this pyramid, right, diversity is actually the peak of the pyramid. That's your end. That's kind of like your main goal and the output that you should be expecting to work towards. Um, there's several layers that you have to go through before you can get to the top of the pyramid. You have to make sure that actually at the bottom of the pyramid, you're providing equity, that you understand that individuals are individuals. Everyone has got their different starting points, and you need to provide personalized adjustments and ways of working with people in order to level the playing field and to actually make sure that we've got equality within the workplace. Then we can focus on inclusion and belonging. Um, when you've got all of that in place, that's when you're in a much stronger position to be able to attract and recruit and retain diverse talent.
So let me ask this. You're saying that, and I think here's where the problem comes in with this. You're saying that you need to provide personal adjustments,
Yeah.
but that we then also have to be inclusive of many much broader groups. How do you align the two? And I get the idea that corporations maybe think they need to focus on one specific group at a time, but that almost sounds to me to be counterintuitive to the idea of inclusion. So, it's a gargantuan task to say the least.
Yeah.
But how do you provide personal adjustments, encourage different groups to feel included without being marginalized and saying, wait, this is supposed to be about inclusion. Why are we only talking
Yeah.
about them? And how do you make that work in a company structure?
So the key is to try and find the commonalities and the synergies between different groups. So if we go back to that siloed thinking that I was mentioning earlier, um, very often organizations will approach or think about one group of people at a time. So let's say, for example, which is very often the case, they'll go, okay, what do we need to do for women in our organization, particularly women who are underrepresented? It could be at a, beyond a particular senior level where there's a glass ceiling in the organization, or it could be a particular department like engineering or technology, for example, where there's a particular underrepresentation. However, there's so many commonalities that actually don't just affect women in that case, for example. So
Right.
I'll give you a really practical example. So with one organization that I was working with, there was a lack of women working at senior levels in the business. And there was an assumption that it was because of the lifestyle of um, of working at a senior level, i.e., there was an assumption that you had to be at your client's beck and call
Mm.
whenever they rang you or emailed you. At a short minute's notice, you had to just jump on a plane in order to go and visit a client overseas and sort out a problem. However, when we dug into it, that wasn't the case at all. Um, the the case was that the business wasn't very good at flexible or agile working, and that was what was holding people back. So a flexible or agile working process or policy was implemented, and people first of all thought, okay, this is going to kind of help women in the organization, but actually, we quickly realized that everyone benefited from it. It helped disabled people who needed to manage their disability. Maybe they had a fluctuating health condition, good or bad days, for example. It helped men who also had parenting or caring responsibilities, either taking children to school or looking after elderly parents. So it benefited so many more people.
So at the end of the day, it almost sounds like these individual groups, and there are many, have an issue, and I'm putting air quotes here for people who can't see us,
Mm,
but an issue that others identify as the prevailing issue with that group. While that may be the case, it's almost like every other group has that issue, but perhaps in a lesser degree, to a lesser degree.
yeah.
So when we perhaps stop labeling groups as being XYZ, incapable of, or of flexibility or whatever, with getting to, in that example, getting to a
Mm,
client or something like that. When we stop labeling them and identifying them by a particular issue
mm.
and recognize that that is their prevailing issue, but everybody has it, implementing those changes, you're saying, will benefit an entire organization.
Yeah, and I've actually borrowed a lot of this thinking from the disability rights movement, because in the disability rights movement, it's basically two ways of looking at disability. Actually, there's three or four, but there's two main ways of looking at it. And we call it the medical and the social model. The medical model basically says that the reason why you're disabled is because there's something wrong with you that needs fixing. If I can be, so blunt. It's not necessarily that you've got a medical issue, that you've got a diagnosis. It's just that you as an individual are broken and you need to have an intervention that fixes you. So if you were
We
to,
all need an intervention, don't we?
we do.
I don't know
So
anybody who doesn't need an intervention.
I mean, take me for example. Like I was born with a neuromuscular disability. Um, so the medical model would basically say there needs to be a way of curing, curing my condition. The social model actually says, and this is kind of the preferred approach, is that we're disabled because of barriers that are created in society. So these could be physical barriers, they could be attitudinal barriers, they could be procedural barriers. So if I want to go out for dinner with my boyfriend of an evening, and that we've got a choice of two restaurants, and one restaurant has got steps up to the door with no lift or no ramp, it's not because I'm in a wheelchair that I'm disabled in that circumstance. It's because there's steps with no ramp or lift. That's what's actually disabling me. So if we take this kind of social model of thinking into the workplace, essentially what we need to ask ourselves is, what are the barriers that people are facing? What's getting in our way? What are the speed humps or roadblocks that are either slowing us down or preventing us from doing something? And we need to be in the business of eliminating and removing those barriers. And this applies to everybody, not just people who are disabled.
So this probably at its most simple form becomes about access.
Mm,
And it's access on so many different levels. As you said, physical barriers are one thing, but flexible schedules could be another barrier in the
yeah,
workplace.
yeah.
One of the things that I think about, I mean, I am not disabled in the traditional sense of the word, although my kids would take exception to that if they were talking about my head. But generally speaking, I tend to think of this, and I even take this a step further, and I think about economic factors where people might not have the education that they would need, or
Mm,
single mothers who are trying to do everything within a certain time frame.
yeah.
So clearly this is a step-by-step process because we're still learning how to do this. But at the end of the
Mm,
day, does this come down to looking at your workforce and looking at
yes.
access to success? Maybe that's the best way to put it.
I like your use of the word access because I think it's access to opportunities or access to
Mm.
success. If you take, for example, what you were saying about universities, if the company has got a policy of only recruiting graduates from a small number of universities, um, it could be either going to those prestigious Ivy League or red brick universities like Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard, for example, um, or restricting it by location. So it might be that you're a business based in Texas, um, and you've got a policy of only recruiting people from Texas universities, for instance. Um, it's about it's about that access to opportunity because you were mentioning about you know, working mums or parents or people who can't afford to go to university. You're limiting your access to that talent pool. So a company could then say, actually, why don't we broaden our scope here? Why don't we continue to recruit people from university campuses, but why don't we also operate an apprenticeship scheme for those people that can't afford to go to university or just don't have the means to be able to go to university because maybe they do have caring responsibilities, and that prevents them from going to university, for instance.
I look at all of this and I think, there's another issue here too, and it is recognizing the other talents that come with these people who are up against adversity. You
Mm,
develop a whole different set of skill sets in terms of resilience, in terms of figuring things out, figuring out problems. And I think that's overlooked perhaps in the corporate
it is.
culture.
It is.
There's you're missing an untapped well of innovative people who've had to figure things out all the way through and
Yeah.
can transfer that skill set to the corporate world.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, this is what clients want. They want that diversity of thought and lived experience. And if you, if your personal circumstances mean that you've faced additional challenges, that does give you extra resiliency. Um, take me for example as a wheelchair user. If I need to go anywhere, I have to I have to plan a lot more than somebody who isn't a wheelchair user. I have to research whether somewhere is accessible or not. I have to figure out the accessible route to get there because the quickest or easiest route might not be accessible for me. I might have to take the long way round. Um, these are all skills that I've developed, and I do think it's because of these skills that I ended up being a project manager for many years. Because I naturally developed those skills and abilities.
I think, it's funny what you just said, take the long way round.
Mm,
I think that most companies, most individuals, most of us want to get from A to B,
mm,
like right away, But how many times does that happen? How many times do
yeah,
we get to go from A to B? So when you open up your workforce and recognize that the adversity and the reasons that the corporate structure has kept people out are
mm,
the very reasons that they should be in,
mm,
because it does take that time, that planning, those extra steps to figure out problems within the corporate world. If you got from A to B right away, there wouldn't be a problem. But
exactly.
I guess what I'm getting at is we have to even further expand our idea of what diversity means,
Yeah,
and maybe generalize it again to the point where we're saying it needs to be all about accessibility.
yeah,
But I will add this. I think the problem with a lot of the DE&I thing, at least that we're finding over here, is that it's talk, but then not a lot of action. There has to be action on the part of the individuals as well.
yes,
The
yeah,
people, when you give them opportunities, people have to take the opportunities and run with it.
yeah. Unfortunately, in the corporate world, there's a lot of what I call window dressing,
Mm,
and also just very performative box ticking activities going on.
right.
So a company will say, "Oh, look how brilliant we are." Somebody, we got a trainer to come in and do unconscious bias training for us. Tick the box. We've done our thing on diversity this year. Thing is that it just it might look good, it might raise awareness, but it has minimal impact. Um, the clients that I work with who are more successful know that this is a long-term game, that this is a marathon, not a sprint, or maybe several sprints. But they know that it's not a quick fix, that
Right.
it's something that's multi-generational. Um, it, it's bigger than just initiatives. It's about culture. It's about systems and processes, and 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 that's what they're really focusing on.
So again, this is the word that I think drives a lot of corporate people crazy, but it is a mindset shift. But
Some of it is, yeah,
this is where we have to make the mindset shift strategic. It has to
yes,
start with a different way of thinking about things, but then it has to have a strategic implementation so
yes.
that something can get done.
Yeah, the mindset shift has to start at the top of the business as well. It's the senior leaders who really understand the why, and
Mhm.
they get it, and they understand its importance and how it's going to help their business grow and thrive and prosper. Um, and then, yeah, like you say, that has to be backed up with actually strategic change as well. It's no good a senior leadership team going, "Oh, it's all great, it's all good. We understand the importance of it." It has to be backed up with action. It has to be and the whole systems and processes need to be looked at as well. It's not just a kind of a one-off thing.
So I guess that leads to the next question. Practically speaking, if you do decide, as a corporate entity, that diversity in all of its fashions, whatever the diversity may mean, and there are many, How do you strategically, logically implement this? Is there a way to do it so that you're not saying, okay, today we're only going to talk about women. Next year we'll talk about ethnicity. Next year we'll talk. Are there
Yeah,
basic shifts within a corporate structure that can be made and implemented that will kind of get this ball rolling everywhere, and
yeah,
then you can address the individuals as they join your company?
yeah, there is. And actually, this is something that I'm writing about in my second book. Um, so I've developed, having worked with a number of organizations now, I've developed this model called the Inclusivity flywheel. And the reason why I've called it a flywheel is because a flywheel is, once you've built up momentum, it keeps spinning. And ideally, if you get this right in your organization, diversity and inclusion will keep spinning. It's not a project with a beginning and an end that's one and done. It's a continuous process. Um, if you imagine the flywheel is kind of broken up into segments like an orange, the first segment is around awareness, and it's about raising awareness. And some people might go, oh, yeah, that's what companies normally do. But I think it's important that you start by raising awareness in order to normalize diversity and inclusion, because what you're up against is, I suppose, people with very different levels of understanding and appreciation of what we really mean by diversity and inclusion. So you want everyone on the same sheet of paper, same level of understanding. You need to normalize it, and you need to make the topic less scary, because the
Mm.
biggest problem that we're up against is that people are really worried about saying or doing the wrong thing and causing offense or embarrassment or putting their foot in it, or causing major issues. So we kind of need to raise awareness and normalize it. That's kind of first one. The next step is you need to swiftly move on to engaging your senior leadership team and really driving this from the top.
Mm.
And the first thing that you need to do with your senior leadership team is get them crystal clear on why EDI is important to the future success and growth of their business. Um, and I say this to my clients because any senior leader can go on Google and download, or research why is diversity and inclusion important for business. They'll get a load of important, stats and information. They can read the 3 or 4 reports that McKinsey have written. Invariably, they often leave confused, thinking, yeah, but I get it. I understand why it's important, but I just don't know how I apply it to my business, like
Right.
my unique organization for my sector, and the problems or challenges that we're facing and the culture that we've got within our organization. So a lot of work that I do with my clients is helping them understand why it's important to their unique business.
I think that's really essential because, again, we introduce these topics and they kind of become this nebulous sort of idea that then nobody knows how to take and turn it into something that becomes practical.
Yeah,
But I love this idea about it being the inclusivity flywheel. Is that what you're saying? The flywheel?
flywheel. Yeah, yeah.
I love that idea because the thing that I think is important about all of this is that it's a constantly evolving model, and it evolves based on what our ideas of this are, but then it also evolves further for a company based then on the individuals that they bring
Mm,
in and who become part of their team.
yeah,
So a big part of this is accepting that, and perhaps this is good for business across the board, but accepting that we can't do business as usual anymore. We
mm,
have to kind of take business as usual off the table and say, okay, what's business mean today in this moment? And how do we
yeah,
continue to evolve towards tomorrow?
yeah, yeah. I mean, expectations are changing.
Hmm.
Um, we've got new challenges in society. Um, we've still got inequalities in society. We've got younger generations who've got very different expectations about the world of work compared to older generations, not just around diversity and inclusion, but they've got expectations around things like sustainability, the environment, flexible working. that kind of thing. Um, and so organizations need to keep up with the times, you know, because a lot of my clients actually say that they feel that if they don't invest time and effort in diversity and inclusion, they're worried about becoming irrelevant, um, and missing out. And that's what they're concerned about.
So is it important for a company to identify diversity and inclusion as part of their corporate mission? And how do they do that without making it sound like something they just got off of Google?
Yeah. So what I actually get my clients to start with their vision and mission, and then we have a conversation about how EDI will help them do a better job at delivering on their vision and mission.
I really like that idea because it allows them to start with what is of concern to them. It's your business, it's your company structure, it's your all of those things. How do you think the DE&I model will impact your business, will impact it positively? And I think if
Yeah.
people are pushed a little bit to think about that, to me, a lot of times it comes down to bringing in people who have different eyes on a
Mm,
situation, along with a basic understanding. How many times do they tell you, well, let somebody who doesn't know anything about this look at it? And a lot of times those people will come up with a unique perspective on those things.
yeah.
So maybe that's another way to encourage a corporation to look at and go, hey, you know what? New eyes never hurt.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the benefits of having a diverse workforce is an increase in creativity and innovation and doing a better job at problem solving. And that's because you've got people with different perspectives, different lived experiences. If you've got people that are very similar to one another, you end up in groupthink and you end up with so many blind spots.
Well, and I think that's been the model for so long now because it's always been, here's who we are, here's what we do. And there's a danger, I think, in containing yourself within that sort of niche category. Like people in business will say, well, niche down, niche down. Who's your specific client? Who's your specific? And yes, that is necessary, but you can't use that business model across the board because then you limit, as you just very well put it, you limit the creativity and the
Mm,
opportunities to problem solve if you refuse to look at anything but your ideal client, your ideal way of doing business. I mean, who gets to do
yeah,
their ideal way of anything anymore?
yeah. The thing is, even if you niche your business, you'll still have diversity within
Hmm.
your ideal client persona. Because
Right.
take an organization that say they're a fintech organization and they develop banking apps for entrepreneurs, for example. That's quite a small niche in itself. But actually, within that, you've got a huge amount of diversity. Um, Even if you niche it down to, um, I don't know, you're a consultancy company and you only work with chief financial officers, arguably, there will still be diversity within that niche
Hmm.
anyway. So, yeah,
So I guess, well, I want to talk about your books really quickly too, because we're winding up here. But I guess if we could sum this up in terms of um, the concept of it, how would you approach a company and say, this is what you need to do, and this is why you need to do it, and this is how you do it?
yeah. So, my first book, which is called Inclusive Growth, was all about setting out 7 principles for doing EDI well. And it started off with a lot of me listing a lot of my frustrations, um, as an EDI professional. I was like, what annoys me? If organization like what are organizations doing that I think are basically not helping? And because I wanted to kind of codify it and come up with a set of principles of what does good look like. Um, and also I wanted to link it back to the growth of the business. That's why I called the
Mm.
book Inclusive Growth, because I
Right.
was like, how do we make this not a box ticking exercise or the window dressing that I mentioned before, but how do we actually link it to the strategy of the business and how the business grows and prospers? So I did come up with a set of 7 principles. So that's what the first book addresses. So if you're interested in, okay, what does good look like? How do I look at diversity and inclusion holistically? How do I really get it embedded in the business? Then that's what the first book was designed for. Uh, Then when I published that book and I started working with more clients, I realized that it didn't really talk about the how. It didn't really say, okay, how do we actually implement this? And that's what my second book is all about, which unfortunately we haven't got a title for it yet. It's let's just call it the inclusivity flywheel for now, because that's what it's based on. It's based on this flywheel model of raising awareness, engaging your senior leadership team, going out and getting data to understand what are the real problems and challenges that your people are facing. How do you then create a strategy on the back of that data? And then how do you actually practically implement it in your organization and make sure that you sustain change in your business? And that's what the second book's all about.
So, I guess if we have to take this idea and break it down to its simplest form, it's acknowledging what that is, what diversity means,
Mm,
acknowledging what it means within your particular business,
yeah,
providing access for people, and then encouraging that creativity that those individuals then bring to that organization.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's the perfect model.
yeah,
That's the
yeah,
model in the perfect world. But I
yeah.
really appreciate you coming on today and talking about really expanding this idea of inclusivity, because that's something that I've thought about a lot, given just again, the diversity within an individual group of
Mm,
any subset, any subset of a larger group. There is an incredible amount of diversity. And when we
mm,
recognize that each of those people has something to contribute, all I use the expression all the time, all ships rise.
yeah, yeah. And the thing is, there's diversity within diversity
Yes.
or
Yeah.
intersectionality. So my experience as a white disabled gay man is very different to my friend who's an Asian straight disabled gay man. Sorry, not gay man, uh, an Asian disabled um, man in a wheelchair. So, we've got the same condition, but his experience is very different to mine, even though we actually share the same disability, um, and we're the same gender.
So maybe we recognize within those groups, okay, this group has an important thing to share with us, but then it goes further and it's recognizing, all right, now what do you as an individual
Mm,
bring to the team? And I
yeah,
think that if we recognize that diversity is a much bigger thing than one gender or one ethnicity or one disability or one anything,
mm,
we open up an opportunity for the growth of not only the corporations, but the communities,
yeah,
the world in general. Again, I'm talking in very, idealistic terms here, but that's the goal at the end of the day, to
mm,
recognize that everyone has something diverse about them, everyone
yes,
that
yeah,
they can bring
absolutely.
to the table.
Yeah, we are all diverse. And one of my training courses is actually called Diversity Includes Everyone. And it's recognizing that we are all diverse in some way or another. Here in the UK, we have a very diverse country, as does the States. And whether we like it or not, we do live in a very diverse country. The question is, are we actually making opportunities accessible? I really like your use of the kind of access of opportunities. Um, and are we actually creating the environment or the culture of inclusion and belonging within companies where everyone can thrive? Regardless of what their background or personal circumstances are. And one point that I make with my clients is, as an employer, you have a very unique place in society to create a ripple effect. Because if you create an inclusive place to work where individuals can thrive, that impacts society in a huge amount of way. If you think about, access to economic opportunities, somebody who was once unemployed or out of work is now taking money home. That's helping their family, it's helping their community or society. And it all starts with that opportunity to go to work and earn a living.
Exactly. And that's the whole idea of this all ships rise thing, because I love how you talked about that just now as a ripple effect.
Yeah,
When we open the doors to other people and allow their individual circumstances and their transferable skills based on their own experiences
mm,
to influence us in ways outside of their immediate environment, we learn
yeah.
so much more, and there's so many
Mm.
more creative ways to solve problems that we really need to make ourselves aware of that. Toby, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've loved every minute of it. Please tell everybody where they can learn more about you, where they can get the books. I want people to know more about your mentality and your ideas.
So my book or books, soon to be books, are available on Amazon. The best place to get more information about the work that I do is my website, which is Mildon, that's Mildon.co.uk. And I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. So just find me on LinkedIn and connect with me on LinkedIn.
Okay, thank you so much. As I said, this has been fascinating. I love the idea of diversity and expanding it even further to include everybody. So thank you, Toby, for joining me today. And everybody, if you are looking for more inspiration, head on over to brilliantlyresilient.net, where you can get our Brilliance Bits. If you sign up for it, Toby will be one of those Brilliance Bits when this podcast airs. And keep in touch with us via howdy@brilliantlyresilient.net. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Brilliantly Resilient Live. Toby, thank you for joining me today, and we will see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to the Brilliantly Resilient podcast. Join our Facebook group and follow us on YouTube to be inspired with tools to reset, rise, and reveal your brilliance.